Okay, this is part 2 of my barrel stove video. If you missed part 1, I recommend going back and seeing it, because this video really won't make a whole lot of sense without it. And here's the exterior detail on what I came up with for the air inlet. Just a piece of threaded pipe with a flange, and these I think are furniture parts, and I can just crank this down, and it seems to do a pretty good job. I had to bend the pipe down so the door would clear as it closes, however. As you can see, I covered up the original design for the air inlet, and it is not in use at all. So the main reason that I wanted to encourage people to buy 2 of these kits is that the frame for the door absolutely does not work. I tried 3 or 4 of them on 3 or 4 different barrels. What happens is, if you simply bolt the frame to the stove, eventually the steel underneath the frame starts to bend and you lose your airtight seal. At one point I actually put in bolts every 1/4 inch around the whole thing, and it still didn't work. Now you might be thinking, well, just buy a flat gasket and put that under the stove frame. I rejected that idea because I felt that if I bolted the frame to the stove and over tightened one of the screws, I'd bust the frame, because the frame was attached over a soft surface. So I came up with buying 2 kits. That way I could use 2 frames, one on the outside and one on the inside. And I bought some automotive fiberglass cloth, quadrupled its thickness, cut one of the frames. As you can see, there's one of the cuts here, so that I could fit the inner frame inside the stove, and I simply laid them back to back. The outer frame has the fiberglass cloth behind it, and I was able to, with this sandwich method, create an absolutely perfect airtight seal. There's no way the steel could ever bend. The fiberglass cloth keeps it airtight, and the frames will never break because they're back to back and completely flat. The biggest problem I had with the Vogelzang kit was getting the door to hold a gasket. And I find that the door as it's designed won't hold a gasket no matter what you do. This was a major problem for me for quite a long time. The gaskets kept falling off. I used different size gaskets. I used different types of glue. Nothing worked, because the groove is simply not deep enough to adequately hold the gasket. Not too long ago I came up with a permanent fix. I sewed the gasket on. As you can see, I drilled 120 holes in the door and sewed the gasket on with light steel wire. It was very time consuming, and it worked beautifully. You can't even see the steel wire because it buried itself in the gasket. And when I got done, it's impossible to pull steel wire tight when it's going around right angle holes in cast iron. So each one of these loops I grabbed with some vice grips or wire cutters, whatever I had, and pulled the slack out in each one. And this is such a beautiful fix. I get absolutely airtight operation this way. I also wanted to mention, if you decide to build this kit, mount the door as far to the side of the stove as you can. And there's a very good reason for this. Once you fill up the stove with wood and you need to put more pieces in, and your pieces are too long, if your door is off to the side, you have all this room to fit a long piece in sideways. Whereas if the door was in the middle, you wouldn't be able to put the piece of wood in that way. Last but not least, I have my custom handle. If any of you have used this kit, you realize right away that the handle assembly was woefully inadequate. So what I came up with was a much thicker piece of steel, and I bent it a certain way and bolted it. And then the handle I extended with a piece of threaded rod and some other parts to grab onto, and a very heavy bolt to hold the handle on. This has served me very well. It's very tight and keeps the door in right where I want it. So that's not too difficult to do. I had to drill out the hole, the original hole in the door, bigger. Lastly, how could this design be improved? Well, there needs to be some sort of grate in the stove to allow the air underneath the wood as it burns, and that would promote a cleaner burn and less or fewer chunks of coals left over. Some people use a second barrel on top. I'm considering that. That would allow more of the exhaust heat to make it out into the room before it goes up the chimney. And I think I mentioned I need to cover the inside of the bottom of the stove with something that will keep the water from rotting it out. Now I've just started the stove with some birch bark, and I'll probably need to put some more stuff in there to get her going. But within 20 minutes, this will be heating like a bastard. So that's my barrel stove video. Now some of you might be thinking, why go to all the trouble? Well, I like building things. I like solving problems. I like do it yourself. And this was and continues to be a very rewarding project for me. Some of you other people might think, well, why not just buy one of the $1,000 to $2,000 to $3,000 commercially produced stoves? Well, I did. About 5 years ago, I bought a Low-Pi Republic 1750 stove, which was rated for 2,000 square feet. Boy, was I in for a shock. I could not get that sucker to heat just this basement. Forget the rest of the house. And I realized that in order to reburn smoke, you need to have 1100 degree firebox temperature. How they do that is they fill the stove with fire brick in order to concentrate heat inside the stove to reach that temperature. And they have welded onto the sides of the stove extra pieces of steel to create an air barrier between the side of the stove and the outer shell, so that you can mount the stove within 3 feet of a flammable object. I don't know who would do that, but I tried the stove for 3 days, doing everything I could think of. I couldn't maintain a hot fire in that thing. I noticed the air inlet was the size of a pencil. That may have had something to do with it. The stove was very fancy, very heavy, very well built, expensive, and completely inadequate for my needs. So I traded it to my sister for several loads of firewood, and I went back to the thin wall stove, the barrel stove, where I can get, when I come home from work, in 20 minutes I can have a huge blast of heat, and I can put 100 pounds of wood in there and get the house warmed up for that evening and all night till the morning. I don't know what the deal is with the commercially produced stoves. My father has one. He is constantly replacing parts. that stove of his is an Avalon, which is a $2,000 model. He has to replace angle iron inside the stove on a regular basis. The door no longer fits. He doesn't have an airtight seal. He's able to heat his basement with it, and he uses it as a supplement to his oil furnace. I will never again buy a commercially produced stove. They are a joke, in my opinion, and there'll probably be plenty of people that will disagree with me on this. But I need a serious heater. I don't want to have to replace parts that cost hundreds of dollars. I need lots of heat. I need it now. And I also like to tinker. And I think a lot of you might feel the same way. And I don't appreciate loads and loads of cat hair. And that's what I also seem to get here. Anyway, until next time. You gotta move, little one.